Brushes are one of the truly fun features in Photoshop. We access them over here on the Tools palette, either by clicking on the icon or hitting B. We have a series of default brushes that start off. Usually we're working with a soft round brush. Up above we can click and change the size of the brush, or change the hardness of the brush, so we can go from, say, let's make that a little bit bigger, a soft brush to a hard brush. We can also, while we're working here, change the angle of the brush tip. So instead of a circle, we can have an oval. Now, how brushes work is they create a series of tips that are placed closely together. There's one, but if we draw that out, we can start to see the bumps that occur across there, and that's as it's placing individual brush tips along that as we click and drag. If you click and shift click, you'll get straight lines, shift click. So if you're looking for a way to create straight lines, just hold the shift key while you're working there. The brush is controlled down here through the color picker with our foreground color. We can click there and come over and pick up a yellow, and now we're painting with yellow instead of black. By the way, a quick shortcut to go back to the black and white default, just hit the letter D, and if you want to swap your foreground and background colors, hit X. As we're painting, we can pick up colors as we go along by simply holding the Alt key. So I'm in the brush tool, I hit the Alt key, and now I'm picking up a green. Now I'm going to pick up a light green. And so we can just, don't really have to go into our color picker in order to create our colors that we're painting with. We can just use that Option key as we're going forward. Now, brushes work with the brush palette. They also work with several other tools. You'll see brushes loaded. So don't feel like this only applies here. When we look at the options up here, we have quite a few preset brushes. We also have entire brush libraries. Brushes are kept in a separate file called with a .abr extension, so you can actually import brushes and export brushes. You can also create your own brushes. Let's grab a quick selection tool here. Grab us some. Okay, let's make sure it's the quick selection tool. Thank you. I'm going to make this selection and go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and the underline black and white or grayscale will create a brush. And now I can, after I deselect, let's go pick up that yellow again. I can now paint some flowers along the way. But that's just part of what brushes can do. We can also go to the internet and download additional brushes. So in the mood of the season, I did go over to Google and I typed in free Halloween brushes, and it brought me to a site called Brush Easy. I went and downloaded one of their Halloween packets. Apparently I'd already done this before because I found another set of brushes that I had forgotten that I'd downloaded earlier. But we click on it and download that. It will come as a zip file that needs to be unzipped in your downloads folder. When we go to load those brushes, import brushes, it will by default try to go to our presets folder in Photoshop, which is truthfully, if we plan on using these, we should drag it to that, or we can, if we're just going to leave it in our downloads folder, click on that ABR file and hit open, and it will load those brushes for us. So while it's loading, there we go. So I might decide that, yeah, I actually would prefer to have a spider web up there, and let's pick a green, and now I'm going to add that. You'll notice the transparency, like I said, is based on the underlying grayscale of the image, and so that's why it's not painted in, but is in fact just kind of overlaid into the scene with a brush there. Okay, so that's creating some brushes. Then we also have the, if we go up here to the window brushes, brush settings palette, and I at the moment have my brushes and my brush palette docked. I don't really need that. So I'm going to go up here and, oops, in my brush settings. So I'm going to start off with the brush tip. One of the first things you'll notice is the spacing. Like I said, this is a series of brushes. So if I want to have a multiple of them coming through, let's make them smaller so we can see this a little better. We can change the spacing of those brushes. As we tighten that up, it becomes a smoother line, and we can spread it back out to wherever we find that we want it. We can also change their size. Yes, we can change their angle or their rotation if we want sideward facing zombie thingies. So we can do that with any brush. In fact, if you go and grab the just a hard round brush and make it narrow, and then we can add some scattering, a little bit of scattering and a little bit of shape dynamics, which I'm going to cover in just a minute. You can actually make a brush that looks more or less like barbed wire. Make that just a little bit bigger for you here. And so you can get kind of a cool, funky look out of that. And we'll cover those settings again in just a second. Okay, so we have a lot of options for that brush. The first one is shape dynamics. We can change the size of that brush. Make that a smoother line. So we can change the the shape dynamics, and so we end up with some big brushes and some smaller brushes if we don't want a smooth line there. As we space them out, you can kind of see how it is changing those shape dynamics as we go around. We can also change things like its angle if it's not a round brush. We won't see it on a round brush. Or limit its minimum diameter, so we can limit the range of how much that jitter bounces up and down. One of the things that's always kind of difficult is painting grass or hair, and up here there's a fade option, and so what's going to happen is we fade this off versus the number of brush tips we actually have. We get a beautiful fade tapering off effect. B for brush, and I'm using my brackets up and down. Brackets are right beside the P key. The right one makes it larger, the left one makes it smaller, And if we add the shift, it will change how soft those brushes are. I have lost my mouse. There it is. So we have a softer move there. If you make the size really small and make the number of tips that's fading over longer, then you start getting more hair-like features. So as I'm trying to create some grass or eyelashes, we can fade that on out. We also can scatter that brush so it's not bouncing, making nice straight lines, but it's actually bouncing around, and we can have it jitter just on one axis, the direction we're moving, or we can have it bouncing on both the X and the Y as we're going forward. And so that's fun. Then there's this color dynamics, and I'm not going to attempt to hit everything. What color dynamics does, erase a little of that. I'm going to, if you think about, gee, maybe I don't want everything green, I can go into color dynamics and I can, truthfully, the green should vary a little. And every time I make a brush stroke, it will change colors within that the amount of hue jitter I have. If I take it all the way up, I'm going all over the rainbow with it. But what I often do is limit it to about 10 or 15%. Let me turn, I have the brightness jitter turned on at the moment. So turn it to 10 or 15%, and everything starts falling within a certain range. And so I get a more realistic feel to grass, or if I use a brush that's shaped like a leaf, and if I turn off that fade, then I don't have to keep doing it, and we can see that as I do this, see how it's all one color at the moment, and when I click it becomes another color. If while we're in color dynamics we hit that apply per tip, what we're going to end up with is it literally shifting while we make that, while we're holding the mouse down, making that stroke, and you can see it bouncing within a range. That's going to give you much more realistic leaves, grass. If it's fall, we can certainly make a more fall-like color, so that we end up with a smattering or a coloring as we paint, instead of a solid color, which often does not feel natural. So that's a little bit about the brushes palette. Play with it. Oh, one other thing, because you know I always remember something right as I'm about to sign off. You can also, as you're doing this, with our brushes, we can go up here and we can add a preset. Yes, I want to create a preset. I want to include the color in this case and my tool settings, so I can then go back and find that preset and get back to these brush settings fairly quickly. Okay, that's a little bit about color or the brushes. I did not hit the opacity and the flow, and I apologize for that. We should know that the opacity changes the overall transparency. So if I knock it down to a 20% opacity and paint with it, you'll notice that it never, on this brush stroke, it doesn't build up, it just paints at 20% opacity. If I paint back over it, then the next brush stroke will paint at an additional 20% opacity. We can move around that opacity, by the way, with the shortcuts, just using numbers. If I hit 9, I'm at 90% opacity. If I hit 85 fairly quickly, I'm at 85% opacity, or type 100 in this case. Flow feels a little like opacity, but what will happen is as the brush tips go over each other, we will get a building up feeling within the document. I have an awful lot of brush tips hitting, so they're going over top of each other. That is why you're maybe not feeling it as much right there. Okay. Anyway, if you go back and watch the class, you'll see me using those as well. Have a good afternoon, and that's a little bit about brushes.